This is FreshEd, a weekly podcast that makes complex ideas in educational research easily understood. I'm your host, Will Brehm. Today we explore the adoption and scaling of education technology across South and Southeast Asia. My guests are Wyss and Olsen.
If teachers use a new technology to simply teach the same way they've always been teaching, then I don't think anything is improved. The whole point of this, if we're talking about innovations that are designed to work in the classroom for instruction, is that they're going to support or facilitate teachers to do things differently. And that requires knowing your subject. It requires knowing pedagogy. It requires knowing how your pedagogy and your subject interrelate, right?
One example, in a lot of these countries, there's high stakes testing and exams for students, which often are taken on pen and paper, don't include technology. And so teachers who are feeling a lot of pressure to make sure their students pass and prepare them as well as possible are not going to spend their time learning a new technology and integrating it when it's not part of the exam. And so unless the incentives are there, they're not necessarily going to take it up.
Wyss is an assistant project director at the Center for Universal Education in the Global Economy and Development Program at Brookings, where Olsen is a senior fellow. Their new report is entitled From Access to Impact: Government Decision-Making and Scaling of EdTech in South and Southeast Asia. Wyss and Olsen, welcome to FreshEd.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here.
So, this new report that you and Brad put together focuses in on sort of EdTech and government decision-making in Southeast Asia and South Asia. Why are you looking at this region in particular? And how are decisions sort of being made around some of these topics?
So first of all, why this region? I mean, it's two very large regions for sure. We were looking specifically at low and middle income countries in the region, but there's a lot of diversity across the region. There's places where many different languages are spoken. There's many different cultural groups. And so that certainly complicates scaling and how you adapt and think about expanding EdTech to reach different populations. There are also some very large education systems. So again, that brings some interesting complexity into the scaling question. And it's a large portion of the world, and so lots to learn, lots of exciting things that are happening there.
And Brad, why are we looking at EdTech? What's so special about EdTech in this part of the world?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, Will, because some of what we've been thinking about is what that we learned is true for all innovations in education and scaling them, and what's unique to EdTech. And so that's one thing that I hope that we'll get into. But I think the other thing to think about is really ever since the pandemic, technology and EdTech has just really taken off in terms of demand and popularity, and almost exponentially. And now with the rise of AI, in some ways it's kind of sucking the oxygen out of a lot of the education decision-making room. And we wanted to better understand that. I think we all love technology and we also hate technology. But when you start thinking about it in the context of education, I think it takes on higher stakes. We're talking about children. We're talking about learners. We're talking about the next generation. This is a very vulnerable and very important group, and I feel like we need to get it right. And one could argue we're still living in a social experiment, and high-tech digital technology in education has been around for a few decades. I don't think it's been particularly successful in demonstrating clear learning outcomes. And so given this current popularity and given this current time, we just thought it made sense to dig into it.
So let's dig into it. Like for the decision makers who are, trying to figure out which EdTech tool to sort of adopt in their system, what motivates them? Is it to do with they know that this particular technology is going to work and make an impact on learning outcomes?
Not so much. I would say we largely saw that evidence of impact is not a big motivator or not a big reason behind being excited about EdTech and wanting to invest in EdTech. There were several dimensions that really stood out. One was sort of the promise of improvement and the excitement and potential of EdTech. A lot of beliefs around, EdTech can make rapid progress, can address these challenges that have really persisted and that we haven't been able to crack. There's a lot of people who think that EdTech has the potential to scale really rapidly. Maybe it can scale more rapidly than non-tech innovations and to adapt, or maybe it doesn't need as much adaptation. And so this feeling that it can make progress where we haven't been able to make progress before. And then after COVID, of course, there's a strong belief among a lot of people that education systems have to have tech capabilities, in particular, like distance learning, to be resilient in the face of shocks like pandemics and natural disasters. And then convictions too which is very understandable, to have a 21st century society, to have a future workforce, you need to know how to use technology. So that's part of it. But another thing is political incentives and sort of the perception of what technology signifies. So like everywhere in the world, right? New political leaders, they want to make change. They want to distinguish themselves from past administrations, and adopting a new, exciting EdTech innovation is one way to do that. And there are political benefits to investing in exciting, shiny, very visible things like new laptops. Even if in the long term, they might not show results, in the short term, there's something that can bring sort of political wins. And then, of course, decision makers, are human. They're subject to the hype and excitement over something new, just like all the rest of us, and, want to try something new. And then lastly, we saw a lot of external pressures motivating EdTech investment. And these were coming from all different places. So, parents, they learn about EdTech happening somewhere else. They don't want their kids to miss out. But also there's large, powerful companies who are advocating for their products. And then donors, multilateral, bilateral organizations who have their own favorite EdTech projects. They're bringing those to the country. So there's all these different factors working together to increase motivation. But as you say, evidence of impact, not really a standout one.
Let's unpack a couple of these. Brad, this perception of technology and sort of playing into local domestic politics, more or less, how does that play out? Like, why do some governments want to use technology to sort of show progress, show modernity to their electorate?
Right. I think this notion of optics seems to matter a lot. And what we're finding is there really are kind of two areas that exert force on decision makers in this way. And one of them is, as Molly pointed out, what we might call signaling. And I think there are two aspects to that. I think one of them appears to be that many low and middle income countries believe that if they can emulate high-income countries, they will have education success. And there's a sense that these high-income countries have already gone digital, and so the low and middle-income countries ought to do the same, and they'll get the same kind of results. I think that's interesting because if you look at learning outcomes, the high-income countries aren't necessarily always doing best. But again, this is about the optics. I think the other thing is something that when I was in graduate school was called regional isomorphism, which is a fancy way of saying countries want to keep up with each other. They want to look like they're doing as well as or better than their neighboring countries. And so no one wants to get left behind. And I think this idea that if a nearby country has moved its entire educational curriculum platform onto a digital application and you're next door and you haven't done that, then your constituents think that maybe you're falling behind. And so I think there is this signaling piece. I think the other part, which certainly connects to it, is the retail politics of it, the electoral politics. It looks really good to constituents if you're a political leader and you can talk about how X number of schools have digital connectivity, X number of platforms are being used in a particular region. It's cutting edge. You can distinguish yourself from the previous administration, which is something that often happens in education and in politics. And as Molly pointed out, you're able to show that you're being responsive to in-country needs, that we've learned from the lessons of COVID, that we're paying attention to rural communities that have perhaps felt left out. And so I think it's good politics. I think it's good sort of global signaling. And I think that it suggests, and this is where the lack of evidence becomes interesting, that a country is somehow moving forward and not being left behind.
Molly, one of the external forces that you sort of talked about with motivation was around these external actors. So Brad just sort of talked about what was going on internally within countries and perhaps the internal perception of where other countries are nearby and how that might shape motivation. But there's also, particularly in low and middle income countries in Southeast Asia and South Asia, there's a lot of multilateral aid, donors sort of pushing certain agendas, as well as all these EdTech companies trying to sell their products. So how does that impact, the decision-making and motivation for adoption?
We heard one example from an interviewee who was describing a government running multiple EdTech projects at the same time, funded by different multilaterals, and they all had different objectives, sometimes overlapping objectives. They weren't coordinated with each other. And I think that's an example that sort of illustrates the broader challenge. There's a lack of coherent strategy a lot of times. So, governments are offered these external projects that come with resources, expertise, capacity that might be really needed in the system. And so they're, understandably incentivized to take these projects, but they're not always or even often coordinated with each other. And so we see this landscape of sort of disparate initiatives. They're working in parallel. Sometimes they're working on the same thing, but not working with each other. They don't learn from each other. A lot of them run for a few years and then the funding goes away and the project is over. And And so there's not sort of a coordinated strategy working towards something. There's all these just different little islands of things happening. And a lot of these different technologies aren't even interoperable. So they can't work together. They can't share data across the different systems. They can't technologically be part of a broader system. So they're even more stuck in their silos.
As Molly points out, in terms of the multilateral organizations, in some ways it resembles that same set of pressures around country governments, that they too are in a sort of competitive landscape, whether they're willing to admit it or not, where they don't want to be perceived as having fallen behind. And so I wonder if they inadvertently spur each other on to go digital quickly.
This idea that it's not coordinated is quite fascinating, Molly, because if the idea is to try and scale certain technological solutions in a system, not being able to coordinate across a system obviously impacts sort of the feasibility. So do governments that you were looking at, are they thinking about feasibility in that sort of long-term way of trying to coordinate all of these EdTech solutions for, some future system that they're trying to work towards?
I think they think a lot about feasibility, but in the short term. And as a result of the decisions they're making, that a lot of times undercuts the sustainability in the long term. So I think cost is a really good example here. Decision makers are very sensitive to costs. Again, understandably, the budgets are really tight in a lot of these places. And it's always true that education decisions are sensitive to cost, but digital technology is a comparatively high cost investment. And so we saw that this means they prioritize often free or low-cost innovations or work to develop them in-house. But what that means is, companies capitalize on this reality. They may offer free or subsidized services or content directly to these governments. And of course, the governments, like we said, are getting freer or low-cost edtech from the donors as well. As a result of these sort of cost pressures, sometimes the free offers are taken maybe without interrogating exactly how well this project will work or how suited it is to the context. And so there's short-term cost savings, but that also undermines long-term potential impact. And, like we were saying, all of these different free innovations are contributing to this fragmented landscape. There's all these different edtech solutions. They're working in parallel because they're being brought by all different people and they're being selected more on the short-term costs than sort of part of the long-term sustainability. But then in addition to that, a lot of these systems have many different teams, departments, and ministries that are responsible for making decisions about education and about technology. And they're also not always well coordinated or talking to each other. So in Bangladesh, for example, within the Ministry of Education, there are different departments who are managing different education levels, and they're each responsible for the tech in decisions in those schools. But then there's also an ICT body under the ministry's ICT division. And so how exactly they all fit together isn't clear. Or in Indonesia, for example, religious schools are governed by the Ministry of Religion, not the Ministry of Education. And so the decisions get split across different ministries. So an interview in Sri Lanka counted 22 different systems that were built in-house that were not working with each other. Each time that a new need came up, they created a new system. And so that also lack of internal coordination combined with all of these external projects really sort of contributes to this short-term feasibility mentality rather than long-term sustainability.
It's so interesting to hear sort of at that sort of policy level or that national level, the sort of system level, trying to coordinate across different departments, different groups, trying to navigate all these different donors, all these different pressures to think about how to reform a system with technology at scale and some of those challenges. But on the other side, sort of at the coalface, you have teachers. So if you do end up trying to adopt certain EdTech solutions, let's say, it ultimately matters if the teachers can integrate them into their teaching and their pedagogy and in their classrooms. So Brad, what did you find when you looked across this region as to what teachers are doing or how they're involved in this process of sort of EdTech adoption?
Right. I think that's a really important piece. I'm one of those who believes that teachers might be the most important system lever in the entire education ecosystem. One thing that we found is that very rarely are teachers included in the work of designing and developing the education innovations. And maybe that's something that we'll come back to, but it seems that there are innovators who are really focused on doing cool stuff and having their idea come to life. And there are tech vendors that are maybe predominantly interested in making money, but the actual ones who think about teaching and learning, who think about students, who know their students, those are not often folks who are in the room. And I think about that. We also are thinking about and looking at what kind of knowledges must be in place to create the conditions in classrooms for teachers to use these innovations well. And I think that there is, of course, the need to be digitally literate. We talk about that. We talk about the need for infrastructure. There needs to be electricity. There needs to be connectivity. The teachers need to know how to use the machines. But I think there are other aspects that aren't often enough considered. One of them is there needs to be pedagogical knowledge and there needs to be content knowledge, but there needs to be knowledge of how to use the technology to teach the content differently. In other words, if teachers use a new technology to simply teach the same way they've always been teaching, then I don't think anything is improved. The whole point of this, if we're talking about innovations that are designed to work in the classroom for instruction, is that they're going to support or facilitate teachers to do things differently. And that requires knowing your subject. It requires knowing pedagogy. It requires knowing how your pedagogy and your subject interrelate, right? As Lee Shulman would talk about, the pedagogical content knowledge. And now there's this new dimension that's called TPAC, or the technological pedagogical content knowledge. That's pretty sophisticated stuff. And unless they're getting the kind of training that will allow for this, unless they are familiar with, comfortable with, and confident in using technology, it's very easy for them to resist it, to wait it out, to maybe pull a few of their fellow teachers onto the resistance side. You know, there's this notion about how you can get a critical mass. And we heard a lot of people in our study talk about that. And some of it is making sure that you've got teachers who are comfortable with and confident with using technology. This also appears to cut along not quite a generational divide, but a location on the career cycle of teaching divide. So you may have early career teachers who are digital natives, but don't have an awful lot of teaching expertise and experience. And then you've got veteran teachers who have quite a lot of experience, but perhaps aren't particularly comfortable with digital technology. And so I think that there needs to be a kind of intergenerationality to teaching workforces.
Well, just in addition to the lack of training, lack of support, we also saw that the incentives weren't always there for teachers to use the technology in the classroom. So one example, in a lot of these countries, there's high stakes testing and exams for students, which often are taken on pen and paper, don't include technology. And so teachers who are feeling a lot of pressure to make sure their students pass and prepare them as well as possible are not going to spend their time learning a new technology and integrating it when it's not part of the exam. And so unless the incentives are there, they're not necessarily going to take it up. And then they also have, very reasonable concerns about student privacy or security, or AI is a whole separate question, but how forms the learning process. And so there's also genuine concerns about the role of technology in education.
I remember being in, I think it was like 7th grade in New Jersey. And it was when, for whatever reason, the school district signed a deal with Apple. And all of these computers were like coming in, and they had this rule. It was like you have to have 5 computers in every classroom. And that was like, seen as like the thing to do. I remember I had this English teacher who we would read books like American novels in the class. And then during the term, he would draw on the chalkboard the characters in the book. And it was this amazing sort of thing to go through. You're reading and then he's sort of drawing more, and he was a fantastic drawer. But then when these computers came in, they had to go somewhere in the classroom, and so they put him in front of the chalkboard where he used to do the drawings. And he just stopped doing the drawings. And he was one of those older teachers that just didn't know what to do with these computers, and so we never used them. And we lost the drawings, and then he soon retired afterward. I think it was like, to your point, Brad, like he just sort of, there was a generational divide, and it was just like this technology was just not needed for his pedagogy.
That's a powerful example. I mean, it's very vivid. I mean, I can almost see the picture myself. And I think it kind of reminds us that technology is a tool, not a solution. And if teachers are going to use it, it still is going to require that teachers engage creativity and knowledge of their students and knowledge of subject matter and knowledge of instruction. And I think it becomes really important to think about how technology is used. We've got decades of experience to see that new technologies, whether they're film strip projectors, VCRs, smart boards, laptops, don't often actually change the way teachers and students engage in classrooms, and therefore aren't necessarily doing much that's better. And I think it becomes really important that we focus explicitly on how is this going to change the way teachers and learners operate in environments.
I was just going to say, I mean, it highlights that, we have to be precise when we're talking about scaling ed tech. It's not just scaling access to ed tech. Are there computers in the classroom? Is there electricity and internet? You have to have that to make it work. But that's really sort of the fundamentals. We need to scale the use of education technology. So is it just sitting in the classroom? Are they actually using it? And then also scale the impact. Is it actually changing teaching and learning? Because if not, the others are somewhat meaningless.
I like that, Molly. It almost makes me think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And there is this set of levels. And certainly some of these things at the bottom of the pyramid have to be in place, but we can't stop there.
So how do we think about sustainability then? Because, Molly, one of the interviewees said something like, this landscape that you've looked at and you've been describing today is, quote, complete and utter chaos. And that stuck out with me when I read this piece. How did it get this way? How did we end up here where it's so fragmented with so many different companies and approaches and departments working on it and not really knowing if the computers are just sitting in the classroom rather than actually being adopted, or if there's electricity to actually power the computers? How did we get here?
Yeah, so I think this comes back to some of the things we've touched on. Partially it's due to these contributions from companies and donors and sort of the historical relationship between the donors and these countries, as well as the fact that I mentioned that the systems are not necessarily coordinating. The decision making is sort of diffuse. There's a lot of political turnover also that, as we talked about earlier, that interrupts reform continuity. And so things are always sort of starting and stopping. And that's then alongside the fact that technology advances so quickly. I think there's some stat that, in a year and a half, it's sort of obsolete. And so it takes longer than that to test something, find evidence, scale it up. And so there's also a lot of starting and stopping and trying new things that really contributes, I think, to this focus on sort of the immediate next thing rather than the long term.
Is there an inherent tension here between sort of the goals, let's say, of a government that might want to improve learning or train the next generation of citizens and workers in its country, which is sort of this longer term sort of horizon of what education is for, versus what some of these ed tech companies are trying to do, which is like sell as many products as fast as possible so they can have economic growth in the next quarter when they have to report earnings? Is there like that inherent tension seems like is driving a lot of this chaos, let's say?
Yeah, I think it really shapes what products are being created, how they're being developed, who they're being developed for, and whether or not they scale. And so this disparate incentives, I think, really do hinder, create chaos, as you're saying, or take away from a focus on trying to see sustainable learning outcomes because they're thinking about different metrics. And then that's, I think, also coupled with the tension that we were mentioning earlier that education systems do want to see long-term learning outcomes, but you also can't take politics out of the equation. That's just real life. And so there's also that tension as well.
And I wonder if there's also a tension between, frankly, commerce and learning. And the tension here is that I don't fault tech companies for prioritizing market expansion because that's their job. That's what they're supposed to do. But therefore, the incentive system to which they're subject is really focused on how can you sell these and how can you make some money and how can you do it relatively quickly. But what I've noticed, and we heard some folks talk about this, is there's a short-term part of this and there's a long-term part of this. And the long-term part of it, one person told us that we're happy to give the schools our products, give them for free, because partly what we're able to do is create a kind of brand loyalty that will transfer into personal use over several years. And this is going to be awfully crude to say it's talking about hooking young people on devices in the hopes that they will stick with those devices for many years to come. So it's not that they're only focused on the short term. It's that they're really thinking about it differently from how we might think about ed tech if our focus is learning outcomes, if our focus is reaching learners and communities in the hardest to reach areas, if we're thinking about equity, if we're thinking about sustainable scaling. Those are sort of different notions.
I love that idea that like the ed tech companies are actually thinking long term because it's future customers. Once those people graduate, get a job, and have disposable income, we want them to buy Vodafone or we want them to buy Google or whatever it is. Like, I love that idea. Like, they actually are thinking long term as well.
Well, and a lot of the biggest ed tech companies are providing training for teachers, but it's training on their tools and their products. And so it's also the teachers are developing capacity, but it's capacity to use PowerPoint or something like that. And so they also are being sort of skewed in a particular direction for the future. And the companies are maybe creating future customers in the government. So we heard in one country how, when the government is looking to do a big system-wide implementation in a new education management system or something, well, they're going to go with the brand name that they know and have worked with for a long time. They're not going to trust it to a small, unknown local company, even if they might understand the context better. And so there's also in the future, you will turn to us as a system.
How do we think about equity in this sort of part of the world when it comes to EdTech adoption? Because at the beginning of the conversation, Molly, you were saying that this is a region with great diversity in wealth, income, in religious backgrounds, you name it, this is a diverse region. So how do we think about equity across this diversity when it comes to EdTech?
I think sort of and this came up when we talked to a lot of people, the first thing that comes to people's mind when they think about equity in EdTech is rural locations, is people with low connectivity, low bandwidth, and how do we create EdTech that is for them? And not to say that that is not an important question, that is absolutely an important part of equity, but there are a lot of other components, and just solving that low bandwidth question, designing for, offline use or low bandwidth use is not going to get at all these different types of marginalization or types of exclusion that exist. And we heard a lot of assumptions about technology's sort of inherent ability to adapt to different users, to be inclusive, that's one of the benefits of EdTech is it's inherently adaptable. It can, more easily offer content in local languages. It enables distance coaching. But we found that assumption isn't really true most of the time. EdTech innovations do need to be adapted to different contexts, to different needs and experiences. And that's not just low bandwidth. So, for example, girls typically have less access to digital devices and internet than boys do, and they have less free time to use it. When they do have them, they're often given more household chores. And then on top of that, adults often assume girls are less interested or less capable of using technology. So teachers might steer boys towards tech inadvertently through unconscious bias. So just something low bandwidth is not going to reach that group, but maybe an asynchronous option that you can use. It doesn't have to be at a specific time. You can access it in a center, when you're available. That might be more accessible to them. Children with disabilities might not be able to use the technology if there isn't sort of assistive elements tailored to their needs and to very specific different kinds of needs. And if their teachers don't know how to use that, then it's out of reach again. And so I think there's actually a lot more adaptation and contextualization that's necessary beyond just, and it almost sort of flies in the face of scaling and economies of scale, because it's not the same thing being replicated in each place.
By way of conclusion, I'm keen to hear what recommendations you would have. Like, now that you've looked across this region at motivation and feasibility and scalability and all these tensions that are sort of inherent in the nature of these public-private partnerships and equity, what would you recommend for some of these, particularly decision makers, the policy makers of these different countries?
We have a couple things. To that last point, one is really focusing on contextualization of the innovations. And that's not, it's not realistic to say that every innovation will be developed in the country or in-house, but working together, and this is maybe an opportunity for the partnerships you were talking about, working with companies, but also local communities and stakeholders to test, adapt the technology being developed to the actual challenge. And is it a challenge that technology can address, tailoring it to the appropriate context to make sure that it is sort of fitting the need and the actual problem and isn't just sort of a solution in search of a problem. So that would be one. Another that I think is more challenging to achieve certainly is to demand, use data on impact and quality more generally. So things like equity and inclusion measures, things like safety and security, but as well as learning outcomes, but to make that a requirement when working with external actors. And then another one is, really designing and selecting from the beginning with hard to reach users and locations from the start, which is counterintuitive to how most scaling goes. But I think we won't reach the last mile unless we, the quote unquote last mile, unless we prioritize reaching the last mile.
I might add a few to that, which show up in our report. And one of them is to focus on the purpose, not the product. I think that there's a real need here to understand what a particular set of needs are and what technology could do and how it could do it and what it's not able to do. Sometimes it seems like we lead with the product, not the purpose, and there are reasons for that. We've talked about that. But what would it entail to actually bring various stakeholders together and talk about why EdTech is useful in a particular situation? I also think that one of the things that came out and folks told us this is it may be that the most promising EdTech is not in the classroom per se, but that some of the tech applications that are kind of outside the classroom, that are doing support work, whether this is educational management information systems, whether this is different ways of recording and organizing and storing information, the kinds of things that might be uninteresting, these tedious, routinized tasks that we can offload to machines so that humans can be freed up to engage with learners and to engage collaboratively with each other, to think creatively and to think intellectually about the work. That seems like that could be promising, but that doesn't seem to be shiny enough to always attract decision makers. And the last thing I might mention is that one thing that came clear to us in this work is the government decision makers are between a rock and a hard place. They are absolutely aware that they're having to make incredibly difficult decisions, and they're having to do it quickly, and they don't have sufficient evidence. They don't have much research. They're being inundated with savvy marketing ploys. They're also finding that they're having to balance all of these different constituencies. So I would love for us to be able to prioritize what it means to give them the kind of support they need to slow down, have some expertise in the room, and really think about these things. They know these things. They know they're having to move too fast. They know they're making decisions that they're not particularly proud of, but they feel constrained and they need to do something because doing nothing isn't the right call. And so I want to make sure that we're sympathetic to and able to support the really complicated situation in which they find themselves.
Well, Molly Wyss and Brad Olsen, thank you so much for joining FreshEd. Really a pleasure to talk today. Congratulations on the report. It's so fascinating, and I think sort of can be applied far beyond Southeast Asia and South Asia.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Will.
Molly Wyss and Brad Olsen work at Brookings in the Global Economy and Development Program. Their new report is From Access to Impact, Government Decision-Making and Scaling of EdTech in South and Southeast Asia. Please note that opinions expressed on FreshEd are solely those of the host or the guest interviewed, not FreshEd, which takes no institutional position. If you've liked what you've heard today, please rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. Reviews really do help. FreshEd's team includes Fatih Akhtas, Obafemi Ongunle, Phyllis Che Mensa, and Jose Neto. Original music for FreshEd was created by Digital Primate. FreshEd is an independently run podcast and is made possible by listeners like you. Please consider donating to FreshEd by visiting freshedpodcast.com/support. Thanks for listening. I'm Will Brehm, and I'll be back next week.